There's a moment you've probably seen but never fully understood. A man sits in a room full of people, and someone throws a remark at him. It's sharp, maybe personal, maybe designed to embarrass him in front of everyone watching. And instead of flinching, instead of firing back or shrinking into himself, he just looks at the person who said it. Not angry, not hurt, just looking. And in that silence, something shifts in the room. The attacker suddenly looks small. The man who said nothing holds all the power. You've seen this happen, and some part of you knew you were witnessing something real, something that matters. What you were watching was not patience. It was not weakness dressed up as calm. You were watching a man who had become genuinely difficult to offend, and that quality had made him dangerous in ways that most people never become. Here's what nobody tells you about being hard to offend. It's not a personality trait. It's not something you're born with or something you fake until it becomes real. Being difficult to offend is a psychological achievement, and it only happens after certain internal shifts have already taken place. The men who have it didn't stumble into it. They built something inside themselves that most people never build, and that something gives them edges in every room they walk into. Today I'm going to show you exactly what those edges are, why they work, and what they reveal about the architecture of real power. If you understand what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at conflict, criticism, or social dynamics the same way again. Let's start with the first edge, and it's the one that matters most: identity security. Here's what I mean by that. Most people walking around have what I call a borrowed identity. Their sense of who they are comes from external sources. It comes from their job title, their relationship status, their friend group's opinion of them, their follower count, their parents' approval or disapproval. When you build your identity from external materials, you've constructed a house on land you don't own. Anyone can show up and start messing with the foundation because you never actually controlled it in the first place. Watch what happens when someone with a borrowed identity gets insulted. Their reaction is immediate and visceral because the insult isn't just words. It's a threat to the structure they live in. If someone calls them a loser, they have to defend against that immediately, because if the label sticks, they don't know who they are anymore. Their entire sense of self depends on other people not saying certain things about them, which means their entire sense of self is held hostage by whoever chooses to speak. This is why most people are easy to offend. It's not that they're weak or overly sensitive. It's that they've built their psychological home out of other people's perceptions, and any attack on those perceptions feels like a home invasion. Now look at the man who's difficult to offend. He's done something different. He's built his identity from internal materials. His sense of who he is comes from what he knows about himself, from values he's chosen consciously, from a track record of actions he can actually point to. When someone throws an insult at him, it lands differently, because it's not landing on anything that matters. It's like throwing a rock at a mountain. The rock might make a sound, but the mountain doesn't care, because a mountain's foundation goes down to bedrock. The mountain isn't made of reputation. It's made of stone. Here's the part that most self-improvement advice gets wrong. They tell you to build confidence, to believe in yourself, to develop self-esteem. But they never explain what those things actually mean at a structural level. Confidence isn't a feeling. It's not something you pump yourself up with in the mirror every morning. Confidence is what happens automatically when your identity is built on things that can't be taken from you by someone else's words. You don't have to try to be confident when your sense of self is secure. You just are. And you don't have to try to be unbothered by insults when they're targeting a version of you that doesn't actually exist inside your own head. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Imagine two men at a business meeting. Both of them present an idea, and a colleague dismissively says it's stupid, maybe even laughs a little. The first man, the one with the borrowed identity, immediately feels heat rise in his chest. His heart rate spikes. He either fires back defensively or retreats into silence, but either way, he's wounded. He might ruminate on that comment for days, replaying it, composing better responses he wishes he'd given. The comment stuck because it landed on something fragile. The second man, the one with internal identity, hears the same dismissal and processes it completely differently. His first thought isn't about his own worth. His first thought is, that's interesting that he responded that way. I wonder what that's about. He might consider whether the criticism has merit, actually evaluate it on its substance, and if it doesn't, he simply lets it pass. He doesn't carry it with him because it didn't penetrate anything important. The comment was about him, but it wasn't really about him. It was about whatever picture the critic had in his head, and that picture isn't the second man's responsibility to defend. This is the first psychological edge of being difficult to offend. You've stopped living in a house built on other people's land. You've stopped needing the world to validate who you are, because you already know who you are, and that knowledge doesn't require anyone's agreement. This isn't arrogance. Arrogance is overvaluing yourself and needing others to see that value. What I'm describing is something quieter and stronger. It's identity sovereignty. It's owning the territory of your own self so completely that trespassers can't actually trespass because there's nothing for them to steal. Now, I want to show you how to actually build this, because knowing it matters is useless without knowing how to develop it. Identity security comes from three sources, and you need all three for it to be stable. The first source is self-knowledge, which means you've actually done the work of figuring out what you value, what you're good at, what you're bad at, and what you want. Most people never do this work. They just absorb their values from whatever environment they grew up in, whatever their friends believe, whatever the algorithm feeds them. They've never sat down and consciously decided who they want to be. And because they've never decided, they can be pushed around by anyone with a strong opinion. The second source of identity security is evidence. You need a track record of actions that prove to yourself what you're capable of. This is why goals matter, not because achieving them makes you successful by some external measure, but because achieving them gives you data about yourself that can't be argued with. When you've done hard things, you know you can do hard things. When you've stayed disciplined when no one was watching, you know you have discipline. When you've kept a promise to yourself, you know your word means something. This evidence becomes the raw material of your identity, and it's immune to what anyone else says because you were there. You saw it happen. The third source is tested values. Your identity isn't just what you believe about yourself. It's what you've proven you'll do under pressure. Everyone claims to have values. Almost no one has tested them. A man who says he values honesty but has never told a costly truth doesn't actually know if he values honesty. He just likes the idea of it. But a man who's lost something important because he refused to lie, he knows exactly what he values because he's paid for it. Tested values become part of your structural identity because they're not theoretical anymore. They're battle-tested. When you have these three sources feeding your identity, something remarkable happens. You become psychologically expensive to attack. An insult can only hurt you if it can reach your sense of self, And when your sense of self is built from self-knowledge, evidence, and tested values, there's no access point for the insult to penetrate. The attacker is swinging at a ghost. They're fighting someone who doesn't exist in the same way they imagine. And that gap between who they're attacking and who you actually are is where your power lives. Let's move to the second psychological edge, and this one will change how you see every conflict you've ever been in. People who are difficult to offend have developed something I call interpretive control. They control the meaning of events rather than letting events control them. This sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete immediately. When something happens to you, the event itself is just raw data. Someone says something to you, or something occurs in your life. That event doesn't have an inherent meaning. The meaning gets added by you, by the story you tell yourself about what just happened. Here's the thing most people don't realize. That story-making process happens so fast that it feels automatic, like the meaning came attached to the event. But it didn't. You generated the meaning, usually unconsciously, usually based on patterns you learned as a child. And then you reacted to the meaning you generated as if it were an objective fact. Let's say someone doesn't text you back for 3 days. The event is just radio silence. But watch what happens in most people's minds. They immediately generate a meaning. They're ignoring me. They don't respect me. I must have done something wrong. They're probably talking to someone else. None of that is in the event. All of it is interpretation. And then they react not to the silence, but to the story they created about the silence. They might send an angry follow-up text, or withdraw emotionally, or spiral into insecurity. They're not responding to reality. They're responding to a movie they made up, and then forgot they were the director of. People who are difficult to offend have learned to see the gap between event and interpretation. They've trained themselves to notice the moment where meaning gets assigned, and in that noticing they gain something most people never have: choice. They can look at an insult and ask themselves, what is the most useful way to interpret this? They can see an apparent rejection and consider multiple possible meanings before selecting one to act on. They're not slaves to their first interpretation because they've learned that first interpretations are usually just old patterns firing, not accurate assessments of what's actually happening. This edge is devastating in conflicts because it means you can't be manipulated through emotional triggering. Someone who wants to control you, whether it's a manipulative person in your life or just someone who wants to throw you off balance, will try to feed you an interpretation. They'll say something designed to make you feel small, disrespected, inadequate. They're counting on you to swallow that interpretation whole and react to it. But if you have interpretive control, their gambit fails. You can see what they're trying to make you think, examine it consciously, and decide whether to accept it. 9 times out of 10, you'll reject it, because most hostile interpretations people try to hand you are either exaggerated, strategically false, or simply someone else's insecurity projected onto you. Here's a real-world example of how powerful this edge becomes. Imagine you're in a meeting and a superior criticizes your work in front of others, says it's sloppy, maybe implies you weren't taking it seriously. Most people's interpretation fires instantly. They're trying to humiliate me. They think I'm incompetent. Everyone in this room now thinks less of me. And from that interpretation, they react. They get defensive, they stumble through a justification, they stew in resentment for the rest of the day. But someone with interpretive control processes this differently. They notice the criticism, and then they notice their mind trying to generate a meaning. And instead of accepting the first meaning offered, they pause. They ask themselves, what do I actually know here? I know this person criticized my work publicly. I don't know why. It might be because my work was actually sloppy and they're frustrated. It might be because they're under pressure from above and taking it out on me. It might be because they feel threatened by me and want to cut me down in front of witnesses. It might be a test to see how I handle criticism. The event supports all of these interpretations. None of them is definitely true. And here's where the edge becomes a superpower. Because they haven't committed to a meaning yet, they can choose how to respond based on which interpretation is most useful, most likely to be accurate, or most advantageous to adopt. Maybe they decide to take the criticism at face value, look for any legitimate feedback in it, and respond calmly with something like, "You might be right, I'll revisit it." That response is powerful, no matter which interpretation is accurate. If the criticism was legitimate, they've shown they can take feedback like an adult. If the criticism was an attack, they've diffused it without giving the attacker the reaction they wanted. If it was a test, they've passed. They've won in every scenario because they didn't let the automatic interpretation trap them into a losing response. This isn't emotional suppression. I want to be very clear about that. A lot of people hear this and think I'm telling them to never feel anything, to become some cold robot who processes everything through pure logic. That's not it at all. You're still going to feel the initial emotional ping. You're still going to feel something when someone disrespects you. The difference is that you don't have to let that feeling pick your interpretation and your response. You can feel the emotion and still examine what's actually happening. You can acknowledge to yourself that you felt stung while also recognizing that the sting was based on an interpretation you haven't verified yet. The people who master this edge become incredibly difficult to manipulate because manipulation requires you to accept a false or exaggerated interpretation as true. Every manipulation technique depends on making you believe something about yourself or the situation that serves the manipulator's purposes. If you've trained yourself to examine interpretations before accepting them, you're essentially running antivirus software on every interaction. Most manipulations will just fail because you'll see them for what they are before they can take root. Let me tell you how to build this edge because it requires practice. The fundamental skill is slowing down the space between event and response. When something happens that would normally trigger a reaction, you train yourself to pause, even if it's just for 2 seconds, and ask, "What am I making this mean?" That simple question, asked sincerely, breaks the automatic pattern. You'll start to notice that you're generating the meaning, not receiving it, and once you notice that, you can start choosing different meanings. A practical exercise is to take something that bothered you recently, something someone said or did that triggered a reaction, and write down at least 5 possible interpretations of what happened. Not the interpretation you landed on automatically, but 5 genuinely different ways you could understand the event. You'll find that each interpretation would lead to a different emotional response and a different set of actions. And you'll start to realize how arbitrary your automatic interpretations often are, how many times you've reacted to stories you made up rather than to what actually occurred. This brings us to the third psychological edge, and in some ways it's the most important because it's what makes the first 2 sustainable. People who are difficult to offend have detached their emotions from their ego. They can feel things without those feelings threatening their sense of self. This is the deepest level, so stay with me here. Most people have their emotions wired directly to their ego, meaning any strong emotion becomes an identity event. If they feel embarrassed, they are embarrassed. If they feel angry, they are angry. The emotion doesn't just pass through them. It becomes them, at least temporarily. And because the emotion is now part of their identity, any challenge to the emotion is a challenge to them. This is why people get so defensive when you try to talk them down from a feeling. They experience it as you trying to erase part of who they are in that moment. People who are difficult to offend have learned to separate these wires. They can feel embarrassment without being embarrassed. They can notice anger arising without becoming angry in the identity sense. This sounds like a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. When emotions don't hijack your identity, they become information rather than commands. You can feel the pull of a reaction without being controlled by it. You can observe yourself getting triggered without having to follow through on what the trigger demands. Here's how this plays out in a conflict. Someone says something designed to embarrass you in front of others. If your emotions are wired to your ego, you feel embarrassment and then you are embarrassed. And now you have to manage both the external situation and the internal identity threat. You're fighting on two fronts. But if you've detached your emotions from your ego, the sequence goes differently. You feel the sensation of embarrassment, you notice it, and you let it exist without it becoming you. Now, you're only dealing with the external situation. The person tried to embarrass you, and you felt something, but you're not embarrassed in the way that would require a defensive response. You can address the situation from a position of internal stability instead of scrambling to protect a threatened identity. This edge is incredibly rare because developing it requires confronting something most people spend their whole lives avoiding: the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are. Ego, in the problematic sense, is essentially a collection of stories you tell yourself about yourself. I'm smart. I'm tough. I'm respected. I'm attractive. I'm important. These stories feel like truth, but they're really just narratives you've constructed to make sense of your experience. And when something threatens one of those stories, the ego panics because the ego is made of stories. Threaten the story. Threaten the ego. People who have detached their emotions from their ego have done something radical. They've loosened their grip on these stories. They still have a sense of who they are, but it's held lightly instead of clutched desperately. When someone calls them stupid, they don't have to defend the story of being smart, because they're not clinging to that story as the foundation of their existence. They can actually consider the criticism. Am I being stupid here? Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. Let me look at the actual facts. They can evaluate threats to their self-concept as if they were evaluating threats to someone else's self-concept, with distance and clarity instead of panic and defensiveness. This is why people who are difficult to offend often seem like they're operating on a different level than everyone else in the room. They are. They've freed up enormous amounts of mental energy that other people spend defending ego stories. They're not constantly monitoring the environment for threats to their self-concept. They're not running a background process of managing how others perceive them. All of that energy is now available for actually dealing with reality, for solving problems, for making moves, for observing what's actually happening, instead of filtering everything through what might threaten their ego. I need to tell you how this edge is built because it's the hardest of the three. Building this edge requires developing what I call observer capacity, the ability to watch your own psychological processes from a slight distance. When an emotion arises, you train yourself to notice it arising, to see it as something that's happening in you rather than something that you are. This takes practice, often daily practice over months or years. Meditation is one path to this skill, but it's not the only one. Any practice that helps you separate your awareness from your emotional content can build this capacity. Another requirement is learning to hold your self-concept lightly. This means examining the stories you tell yourself about yourself and recognizing them as stories rather than facts. It means asking yourself, what would it mean if I wasn't as smart as I think I am? What would it mean if I'm not as respected as I assume? What would I lose if this story about myself turned out to be wrong? When you can sit with these questions without panic, when you can genuinely consider that your self-concept might be inaccurate without feeling like you're dying, you've started to loosen the ego's grip. You've started to create space between who you are and the stories you've told yourself about who you are. The final component is direct experience of the gap. This usually happens through some kind of failure or humiliation that you survive. When something happens that should destroy you according to your ego, when one of your core identity stories gets proven wrong in a way you can't deny, and you discover that you're still there, that you still exist, that life goes on, something profound shifts. You realize experientially that you were never your stories. You were always something underneath the stories, something that persists even when the stories fall apart. People who've been through this kind of experience often become difficult to offend afterward because they've seen that the ego's threats are empty. The worst has happened and they didn't disappear. They're still here. What is there left to be afraid of? Now I want to pull these three edges together and show you what they create when they work in combination. When you have identity security, interpretive control, and emotional ego detachment all operating at once, you become something rare, a person who cannot be easily destabilized by external events. This doesn't mean you're invulnerable. It doesn't mean you never feel pain or that nothing ever bothers you. It means that being bothered doesn't control you anymore. You can feel something without being captive to it. You can be affected without being hijacked. This is what true power looks like, and it's very different from what most people imagine. Most people think power is about controlling others, making people do what you want, dominating situations through force or manipulation. That's one kind of power, but it's unstable and exhausting to maintain. The deeper power, the kind that sustains itself without constant effort, is internal. It's the power of being unmoved by what would move others, of staying centered when everyone around you is reactive, of choosing your responses instead of having them chosen for you by whoever knows how to push your buttons. People with this kind of power are extremely difficult to manipulate because manipulation requires access to reactive patterns, and they've interrupted those patterns. They're difficult to intimidate because intimidation requires you to believe that something you value is under threat, and they've stopped valuing things that can be threatened by others. They're difficult to control through shame or embarrassment because those weapons only work on people whose identity is externally constructed, and they've rebuilt their identity from internal materials. Here's what happens when you become this person. Your presence in a room changes. You don't have to do anything differently. You just occupy a different psychological position, and others can sense it even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. They'll describe you as confident, as grounded, as someone who has their life together. What they're actually picking up on is the absence of reactive patterns that everyone else is running. You're not constantly scanning for threats to your ego. You're not managing your image in real time. You're just there, dealing with what's in front of you, and that simplicity is so unusual that it registers as strength. This is also what makes these people formidable in any kind of conflict or negotiation. When you're not fighting to defend your ego, all of your intelligence and energy is available for actually winning. You can make moves that ego-attached people can't make because you're not paralyzed by what those moves might mean about you. You can take the hit if it sets up the win. You can appear weak if appearing weak serves your purposes. You can admit you were wrong if admitting it moves you forward. Ego-attached people can't do any of this because every interaction is simultaneously a practical exchange and an identity battlefield. They're always fighting on two fronts, and you're only fighting on one. I want to leave you with something to think about because I know some of you are hearing this and feeling like it's out of reach. Like the kind of psychological stability I'm describing is for other people. People who had better circumstances. People who weren't damaged in the ways you were damaged. I want to tell you directly, that's not true. Every person I've known who has these edges built them on top of damage. They weren't born this way. They became this way through work, through failure, through hitting bottom, and deciding to construct something different from the rubble. The path is not comfortable. Building identity security means confronting how much of your current identity is borrowed. Building interpretive control means catching yourself in real time as you generate, suffering through your own meaning-making. Building emotional ego detachment means sitting with the terror of wondering who you are if you're not your stories. None of this is pleasant, but all of it is possible. And all of it leads to a kind of freedom that most people will never taste because they'll spend their whole lives defending a self that was never real in the first place. Being difficult to offend is not a party trick. It's not a technique for winning arguments or impressing people at social gatherings. It's the external symptom of profound internal work. Work that fundamentally changes your relationship to yourself and to everything that happens to you. The edges I've described today are not separate skills. They're different facets of the same achievement. Becoming the author of your own experience instead of a character in a story someone else is writing. Start where you are. Pick one edge and begin building it. Notice when your identity feels threatened and ask yourself what story is being challenged. Notice when you're generating interpretations and ask yourself what other interpretations are possible. Notice when emotions are hijacking your sense of self and see if you can create even a millimeter of space between what you feel and who you are. That millimeter will become an inch and the inch will become a gap, and the gap is where your freedom lives. The people who watched someone throw an insult at them and saw that person look small afterward, they didn't get there by accident. They got there by building something inside themselves that made insults land differently. They got there by becoming people who couldn't be easily reached by what reaches everyone else. And that building, that becoming, is available to you too. The man who cannot be offended cannot be controlled. And the man who cannot be controlled is the only man who is truly free. Start building.